Let's go.
Wade Davis is a professor of anthropology at the University of British Columbia in Canada. For years, he served as explorer in residence at the National Geographic Society. He was named by the National Geographic as one of the explorers of the millennium. He has been described as a rare combination of scientist, scholar, poet, and passionate defender of all the world's wondrous diversity. He holds degrees in anthropology and biology from Harvard. He got his Ph.D. in ethnobotany from Harvard. He spent years in the Amazon and the Andes as a plant explorer, living among 15 indigenous groups. In recent years, his work has taken him to East Africa, Borneo, Nepal, Peru, Polynesia, Tibet, Mali, Togo, New Guinea, Australia, Colombia, Mongolia. Has he been to Fridley? Wade Davis is the author of close to 400 scientific articles and 23 books. He's given TED Talks multiple times, talks that have been viewed by millions. His books have appeared in 22 languages. Am I done? No! He's an honorary vice president of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, recipient of 12 honorary degrees, the Gold Medal from the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, the Explorer's Medal, the David Fairchild Medal for Botanical Exploration, the Centennial Medal of Harvard University, the Roy Chapman Andrews Society's Distinguished Explorer Award, the Sir Christopher Medal for Exploration, the Mungo Park Medal from the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, and in recent years he was made a member of the Order of Canada. This dude has some credentials, people. But what am I having him on the show to talk about? Zombies, of course. What did you think? I'm actually quite serious. I recently read Wade Davis's book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, a book that was eventually made into a Hollywood movie called The Serpent and the Rainbow. Wes Craven made it. Anyway, this Serpent and the Rainbow book took me into the world of voodoo. Now, I was never into this Wes Craven film because despite the popularity of zombies in American culture, the TV series The Walking Dead, just one example, I've never found zombies interesting in fiction. I find the story of zombies in nonfiction, however, quite interesting. As for voodoo, well, I've been fascinated with the world of voodoo ever since a trip to New Orleans a few years ago. I was in New Orleans, staying at a place where I happened to stumble upon a voodoo priest and priestess. You don't stumble upon those types in Minnesota. Or if you do, you're on LSD. Anyway, these folks I met in New Orleans, they told me that voodoo gets a bad name because of all the silliness and nonsense people make up about it, voodoo dolls and that sort of thing. They told me one important precept of voodoo is that you can't go to bed at the end of the day without having made another human being happy. Wait, what? That sounds like kind of a country charm type of religion. I soon learned that a significant percentage of New Orleans folk, including bank presidents, realtors, dentists, dabble in a little voodoo from time to help guide decisions they're making. They meet with a voodoo priest or priestess in New Orleans, and they're given some insight thanks to these voodoo practitioners' ability to get in touch with the spirit world. The story with voodoo is that the spirit world and our world are separated by a very thin veil, and you can gain access to that other side through spiritual possession, allowing yourself to be a vessel for the spirit world. I learned that voodoo was a religion that took hold in New Orleans long ago because of the African slaves who were brought to New Orleans by way of Haiti. Haiti, by the way, was the only place in the world that ever had a successful slavery revolt, where the slaves won. They ousted the French, and not only ousted the French, but when Napoleon heard about it and went nuts and sent an entire army from France to get Haiti back, he lost. They shut Napoleon down. The Haitians were some badass fighters. I mean, the only ones to pull off a revolt successfully and against a beast of an oppressor? I mean, I gotta ask, was voodoo involved? Now, here's the deal with zombies. For years and years and years in Haiti, people have been talking about seeing or hearing about zombies. They talked about them as if they were real, but of course they could not have been real because a zombie is someone who dies and then is dug up from the grave and lives on in some sort of catatonic state with no free will of its own, a slave. For years, anthropologists from America heard about these zombie stories from Haiti. But it wasn't until the 1980s that a verifiable zombie-type story was discovered. Yep, a guy by the name of Clervis Narcisse appeared in a village 20 years after he was supposed to have died. American doctors at a prestigious hospital in Haiti had in fact confirmed that death back in 1962. This Narcisse fella was pronounced dead, buried with a gravestone, and then in the 1980s he reappeared, stating that he had been a slave to a slave master for years after being dug up from the grave. 20 years had gone by since he was dug up. Narcisse said right after he was buried he was exhumed and given a drug of some sort that caused hallucinogenic effects, memory loss. A sorcerer recovered him from the grave and forced him, alongside others, to work on a sugar plantation for years until the sorcerer's death. When the sorcerer died and regular doses of this hallucinogen ceased, well, Narcisse regained his sanity and went looking for his old village and his sister, and he found the village and he found his sister, and she verified it was him. Well, word of this got to the Harvard Anthropology Department, and they sent my man, Wade Davis, to investigate. The belief was, if this was the first verifiable case of a quote-unquote zombie, there had to be a scientific explanation. And the science was no doubt going to include some plant ingestion or some drug ingestion that caused a body to mimic the state of a dead person. Weirdly, Narcisse had a scar on his cheek that was from what he claimed to be a nail hammered through the lid of the coffin. Yikes! Well, it turns out there are drugs that can fool a Western-trained doctor into thinking someone is dead when they're not. And Wade Davis discovered what that concoction was. A world-traveling, living on the edge, real-life Indiana Jones of sorts. Coming to you right after this break. There are a lot of car dealerships in Minnesota. A lot. And most of them, well, they sound and act and look the same. Even their commercials are the same. You know the pitch. You know the speed of it. You know the sound of it. But there's a place with locations in South St. Paul, Stillwater, Waconia, and Forest Lake where they're not trying to sell you anything. I know, that sounds impossible. But walk in there. Just walk in to Fury Motors. And notice what doesn't happen. Notice what doesn't happen. You're not swarmed. Nobody disappears to talk to a manager. Nobody makes you feel like you're playing a kind of game that you didn't really sign up for. They just talk to you. They figure you came in there to address something, to solve something, to improve something in your world. They'll help you solve your problem. That's what they do at Fury Motors. Red Leonard said in '63, just take care of people. Just take care of people, and they'll come back. Fury Motors. I want to talk to a specific listener right now, a very specific listener. You own your own small business. You're 50 years old or older. You want to grow your IRA, your 401k. You want to get smart with your money. You want to get smart about retirement savings. You've done okay for yourself in life. You have some dough, but will you be able to grow it? Work it in your favor. A lot of guys think they know the game, but it's like anything. A plumber, a lawyer, a doctor. There are experts. You use them in your life. Why are you not using a financial investment expert? A guy who puts his money where his mouth is, doing the same thing with his money that he's telling you you should do with yours. Here's what I want to say to you. Call Josh Arnold, a man with over 40 years of experience, the best independent voice for money matters in the state of Minnesota. He'll visit with you for 50 minutes on the phone for nothing. If you end up liking what you hear and going with him as your money guy, you text me, I'll buy you lunch. And I'm quite serious. Find Josh Arnold at 952-925-5608. Find me at 651-321-8949.
Investment services offered by Josh Arnold Investment Consultant, LLC, a security and investment advisor. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All investments involve risk. Tommy Mischke is a paid endorser.
The Serpent and the Rainbow is a scientific investigation and personal adventure story about zombies and the voodoo culture of Haiti by a Harvard scientist named Wade Davis. Back in the 80s, ethnobotanist Wade Davis arrived in Haiti to investigate documented cases of zombies. People who had reappeared in Haitian society years after they had officially been declared dead. Drawn into another world of rituals and celebrations, Wade Davis penetrates the voodoo mystique deep enough to place zombification in its proper context within the culture of Haiti. In the course of his investigation, Wade Davis came to realize that the story of voodoo is the history of Haiti, from the African origins of its people to the successful Haitian independence movement, down to the present day, where voodoo culture is, in effect, the de facto government of Haiti's rural countryside. I welcome him to the show now. Glad to have you here with me, Wade.
Thanks, Tommy.
I love the story of hearing how you got from the wilds of Western Canada to the steps of Harvard University. Can you tell that story?
Well, Tommy, that's a wonderful story to begin with, particularly given your audience and your podcast is radiating out from Minneapolis, a city that's on everybody's minds and everybody's hearts these days.
Thank you.
And this story tells you all that's great about America. I was a kid growing up, modest family in Canada and British Columbia. I would fight forest fires when I was 15 and work in logging camps. And our fire camps were overrun in the late 60s by American draft dodgers who were fleeing to Canada. And we were sort of obedient Canadian lads. And these Americans had this irreverent charisma, and they would tell our bosses to piss off. When you're 15 years old and someone tells your boss to piss off, you notice. And one of them, by chance, had the Life magazine with the Harvard student strike of 1969 on the cover. And in a kind of adolescent way, I thought, well, that must be the college you go to become cool like these guys. And so I applied to Harvard and I got in. But my mom and dad didn't have the money to go all the way from British Columbia to Boston with me. So they put me on a plane with my enormous steamer trunk with everything I owned in it. And I arrived at Logan Airport in Boston, and I suddenly realized, and I guess at the time I was 16 or 17, I had no idea where Harvard was. And I saw this guy with a Harvard t-shirt. I thought he's got to know. He didn't know either. And so, and my family didn't take taxis, Tommy. So I got in the subway system. And I dragged that trunk across Boston, emerged in Harvard Square. At the time, it was a complete madhouse of SDS and Hare Krishnas and people getting high and having fun. And suddenly I realized my mom had made a mistake, and she had sent me down to Harvard 10 days early, and the dorms weren't open. So there I was without a penny in my pocket and nowhere to stay. And I dragged my trunk through the streets of Cambridge until I ran into a church. And I knocked on the door, and a pastor opened the door, and he offered to put me up for a week. And that moment is when I fell in love with the United States.
It's a crazy time in the country, a wild time to be at college, but pretty soon it's time for things to get serious. You have to declare a major, and you don't know what you want to study. In fact, it's the night before you have to declare, and you still don't know.
It came around time to define your major, and I hadn't given it a thought, Tommy. I ran into a friend in the street, and I said, well, Stuart, what are you going to major in? And he said, anthropology. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, you read about Indians. I said, well, that'll do. And so I signed on as a student of anthropology. And I think there's a lesson here for young people who are taught all their lives that, life is linear, that you've got to go from A to B and then C and D. If you skip E and F, you never get to the rest of the alphabet. Well, of course, we all know that life is not at all linear. It's made up of these kind of crossroads and serendipitous moments when you've got to seize the opportunity and go for it. It's like Jim Whittaker, the great Everest climber, said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. So I began my studies of anthropology, but after about a year, I kind of grew tired of just reading social theory and reading about Native people in books. And I was with a roommate of mine who was a rough-cut kid from the West in a cafe in Harvard Square, and there was a map of the world, by chance a National Geographic map of the world. And David, my friend, looked at the map, and he looked at me, and he looked at the map, and he suddenly pointed to the high Arctic. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I watched my left arm lift and hit the Northwest Amazon of Colombia. And had I landed in Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar, but having decided to go to the Amazon on a pure whim. And, this was also part of the era of the 60s. I think a lot of us were looking for more authentic life experiences. Remember, that was the whole dynamic. Our poor mothers and fathers had endured the Depression, endured the war. In the case of my father, really been broken by the war. In the 1950s, all they wanted was calm and stability and predictability, which was their due. But for us growing up in that era, materially spoiled as we were, that wasn't enough. And it provoked this kind of hunger for which the 60s sort of became known. And so hitting the open road in pursuit of one's destiny was not an unusual thing for young people to do. I just picked an unusual destination.
So you headed to South America and you dove headfirst into the world of plants and plant medicine and plant mystery and plants as used in religious ceremonies.
For about 6 years, all I thought about was plants, and I collected probably 30,000 specimens and from some of the most remote reaches of the Northwest Amazon and the Andes. And after a while, as I went to graduate school, having spent time with dozens of indigenous groups and written many academic papers on their use of plants as medicines, narcotics, hallucinogens, food, I was sort of hungry for a more intellectual challenge, and there was always something waiting for you in the fourth floor office of Professor Schultes. And one wintry day, he summoned me to his office and said very casually, would you like to go down to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrate the secret societies, and secure the formula of a drug used to make zombies? Well, naturally, I said yes, thinking that it might be a lark over spring break, but the assignment would end up consuming 4 years of my life and lead to the writing of 2 different books, one of which was made into a Hollywood movie.
And you would enter the world of voodoo, something you knew very little about.
We think of voodoo as a dark magic, black magic cult. It's not. It's simply the religion of Africa, of West Africa. Voodoo is just like all religions, it's a spiritual worldview that tries to understand the nature of death, what happens to us beyond the grave, if you will. In many ways, it's a very democratic faith because the believer not only has direct access to the divine, he or she actually becomes the spirit through ritual. And zombies are the living dead, an individual who is, by folk definition, an individual who's had their soul stolen and cast into a sort of state of perpetual purgatory, often said to involve some kind of servitude. And obviously the team of scientists who sent me down there, which included some of the great psychopharmacologists of the country, including Nathan Klein, who had won 2 Lasker Awards, which is the U.S. equivalent of the Nobel Prize. And they were interested in the reputed existence of a folk preparation that was said to bring on a state of apparent death so profound it could fool a Western-trained physician. And they were interested in this drug for its possible application in modern medicine.
Tell me about the zombie who seemed to be the first guy doctors were pretty sure had died, and yet somehow he was still walking around.
This man had been pronounced dead in the Albert Schweitzer Hospital, run at the time by Larry Mellon, which kept impeccable records. And his death had been witnessed by 2 American-trained physicians. The death certificate had been examined by forensic experts. And there were all these lines of evidence.
The thinking was this guy had taken something that caused his body to appear to be dead when it was alive. You had a great interest in figuring out what could do that.
Nobody had managed to secure its formula to see if it really had something biologically active that could account for this possibility. And that was my job, was to go down and secure that formula. And I wasn't looking for a preparation that could kill someone. Lots of things can kill. I was looking for something that could fool a physician. And as it turned out, the essential and consistent ingredients in the 8 or 9 samples that I saw prepared, collected in various parts of Haiti, besides human remains that were put into the poison for magical reasons, the consistent ingredient turned out to be a marine fish, which we knew well because it was a relative of the famous fugu fish of Japan, the culinary delicacy that people eat with great care because the fish has within its viscera and on the surface of the skin a very powerful neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin, which blocks sodium channels and brings on peripheral paralysis, dramatically low metabolic rates, and yet consciousness is retained until death. And in fact, in the literature of Japan, completely unrelated to anything going on in Haiti, I found case after case after case of people misdiagnosed dead, even nailed into their coffins by mistake.
Another big question was, what was the point of creating a zombie? What was the point of giving somebody something that made it appear as though they were dead and then reviving them later and keeping them in some addled state?
What the heck is a zombie? Why is someone made a zombie? And if this is true, who's controlling the process? It turns out that the zombie poison was a form of capital punishment invoked in Haiti, much as the secret societies do in West Africa, societies that have judicial functions. They have punishments and they sanction people by the use of poisons. And it turns out that Narcisse was not a great man, and his zombification was a form of capital punishment. And that's why a zombie loses their soul. That implies losing your autonomy. And when they talk about enslavement, you lose your physical freedom. And again, the 2 things, particularly given the Haitian history, combine to make zombification a fate worse than death.
You actually got into these secret societies in Haiti where punishments like zombification were doled out. You were the only white guy to ever be allowed into these secret societies. You won your way somehow into their trust.
You have to understand, Tommy, these societies were so feared that when I applied to the National Science Foundation for a grant to pursue the study of them, I received the money, but the anonymous academic reviewers, all Haitian experts, wrote on the documents that I had to be told that if I did this research, I would be killed. That was literally the perception of these societies. I didn't think it was true, or I wouldn't have done it. But no one had really gone close to these societies. And I was able, through relationships and time and patience and good fortune, to actually be invited to become a member of the societies. And I was actually initiated into the Bizango Champuel. This was very much African in its roots. And if we go to West Africa, where these secret societies are ubiquitous, they're the most powerful arbiter of social and political life. They have tribunals, they have hierarchies, they punish people, and they do so with poisons. It was as understandable and, in a sense, elemental as our own institution of capital punishment and our own tribunals in the judiciary.
If living in Haiti for decades, I wouldn't have necessarily run into zombies. I would have heard about them the way maybe in the Pacific Northwest in the United States I'd hear about Sasquatch. I'm not seeing Sasquatch, but the stories are everywhere. What fascinates me, though, is that there would be enough evidence for someone to take it seriously. And by seriously, I mean believing that something was happening to these people. It was probably something they're ingesting that mimicked death. Let's find out what that is. And there was a belief, I think you'll agree, that if you could find out what that is, there might be some help for all of humankind for what is learned there. There might be uses for this. It wasn't just, how do you find a zombie?
No, I mean, it was even, anesthesiology is much more complicated than people understand. It's easy to put someone out. It's hard to make sure they come back in one piece, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And so they were always on the outlook for new anesthetics in general. NASA was interested in the challenge of artificial hibernation for long interplanetary space voyages. What do you do with an active personality pilot when they've got to sit around for 6 months to get somewhere?
I want you to picture a couple of worlds. They're places you could put your loved one with dementia or Alzheimer's. There's a world out there you find all over the place where staff parks your loved one in front of a television set, and that's their day. Treats your loved one kind of like a little child. Those places are all over. And then there's the Welshire of Bloomington and Medina, where all they focus on is memory care, and they've realized it's best to break it up into the 4 stages of memory care, to have 4 households for those 4 stages, to have experts in those 4 stages working to create an environment that's absolutely loving, warm, inviting, convivial, joyful, to spend a lot of time with your loved one, laughing, talking, playing music, taking them to the ice cream parlor, on site, the cinema. There are different worlds out there, but you'll never know about them until you tour those different worlds. Tour the Welshire of Bloomington and Medina. Jim's grandfather died in 1956. His boiler is still running. Same boiler, same house in St. Paul. The people who live there now, they have no idea. But I know, because MSP installed it in 1948, and when Jim sold the house in 2018, he told the new owners, whatever you do, don't touch that boiler. See, there's this thing that happens when a company has been around since World War I, like Minneapolis-St. Paul Plumbing, Heating, and Air. They stop thinking in quarters and start thinking in generations. Minneapolis-St. Paul Plumbing, Heating, and Air doesn't dabble. They don't also do boilers, along with furnaces. They've been keeping Minnesotans from freezing to death since before it was called HVAC, since before air conditioning, since before your great-grandmother was born. Minneapolis-St. Paul Plumbing, Heating, and Air, still here, still warming the houses their grandfathers warmed. I'm back with Wade Davis, author of The Serpent and The Rainbow, and one hell of a lot of other books, frankly. You travel the world, you immerse yourself in different cultures as a means of learning about them, and to do that, you can't come charging in as a judgmental Westerner. You'd get nowhere doing that. You come in, usually without any judgment at all, so as to learn what exactly you're looking at. What is this world? Now, sometimes you guys who do this get criticized for being so accepting of all you encounter, good and bad. What's your response to that?
Sometimes anthropologists are accused of embracing a kind of extreme relativism, as if every trait of behavior has to be defended just because it exists. That's not true. Anthropology never calls for the elimination of judgment. It calls for the suspension of judgment, so the very judgments that we're ethically obliged to make as human beings can be informed ones. And voodoo is a good example of that. Naturally, wherever the African people went, and the enslaved came from everywhere from Senegal around to Mozambique, they brought their religious faith. It makes perfect sense. And when the people landed, their religious beliefs became informed by their new situation. And that's why we have throughout the Americas different forms of African religious practice. So you have, in Dominican Republic and Cuba, you have Santeria, which has got a strong Catholic element to it. You have Obia in the revival churches in Jamaica. You have Macumba and Candomblé in Belém in Afro-Brazilian parts of that country. And you have hoodoo in the American South in New Orleans. And the thing that makes Haiti, again, so interesting, whereas Jamaica, British colony until 1963, with all the influences that implies, Haiti's independent, 1804, and it's completely isolated for almost 100 years. And that's why the African continuity is so strong in Haiti. Voodoo is, the essence of voodoo is simply a way of understanding what happens to you when you die. When you engage in ritual, the ultimate moment of African belief is that moment when you summon the spirit, and the spirit momentarily displaces the soul of the living. And one of the things that I found so impressive when I first arrived in Haiti was to visit ceremonies where you saw individuals cast into trance, handling burning embers, burning coals the size of small apples, red hot, glowing hot in their mouths with impunity, a kind of what struck me as an amazing example of how the mind can affect the body when kind of liberated in a state of excitation and ecstasy. And so I remember thinking, my God, I used to walk around Haiti in the early days, always remembering that line from the Dylan song, there's something happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones, And I just had a strong feeling that if these physical manifestations coming out of religious practice were so self-evident, seeing them before my eyes, I had to not just take the whole thing seriously, I had to accept the possibility that through religious devotion, Haitians, Africans in general, were achieving a kind of ecstatic liberation, if you will, that we might call spirit possession, but whatever it was certainly not some sign of mental breakdown, but was rather a sign of divine grace. And when you witness that, and if you do so with an open mind, it's very uplifting, inspiring. And if it provoked anything to me, it would be almost jealousy that in my religious tradition, I don't have that kind of direct access to God.
Yeah, I mean, I could relate it to experiences growing up Catholic and then finding members of my family joining a charismatic Catholic community where suddenly things got very different, and you had the speaking in tongues, and you had the possession of the Spirit, and that was in the rather banal Midwestern world of Catholicism.
Well, I think my goal in all of this, we often judge harshly cultural practices that we indulge in ourselves. So for example, if you think of Holy Communion in your Catholic Church, remember that the theory of transubstantiation empowers the Catholic priest to turn that wine and that wafer, not metaphorically, but literally into the blood and body of Christ. That's the whole theory. That's the difference between Protestant faith and Catholic faith, right?
Right.
And that means that when you take Holy Communion, bless you, but you are essentially indulging an endocannibalistic ritual. You're eating flesh and drinking blood. By the same token, if you go to the Mother Church of the Capuchin Order in Rome, you can go down, as you may have done, in the crypts, and you can see the flayed bones of thousands of Capuchin priests, skulls piled up as altars, tibia bones used as chandeliers, vertebrae as applique on the walls of the crypt, and so on. And there's a little sign there that says, that which ye are, we once were. That which we are, ye shall become. And this, of course, is a great admonition of Christianity, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, get ready for death. It's coming. Who are we then to judge the Haitian use of human remains or the Tibetan use of bones, for example, in musical instruments, when we're doing the same thing in the city of the city of Christianity, Rome itself?
My uncle was a missionary in New Guinea back in the 60s. He was the last guy to see Michael Rockefeller alive. And he used to tell me the reason the missionaries were so successful with those tribes there, they practiced cannibalism, and the Catholics would explain their religion to them, and they'd see birds of a feather. I see almost two different roads that you took, and they probably speak to at least two different parts of yourself in Haiti. There's one way you could have gone to Haiti where you get the formula and you use that for the betterment of mankind, maybe in anesthesia, maybe in other ways. Maybe it ends up being used by the space program. One way is purely, I want to get at what it is that's making these people seem like they're dead to Western doctors who should know better. There's another way. You could take that out of the entire story. To hell with the whole science of it. And you could have just had the story of the way a culture operates and the fascinating world of a religion within a culture and the fascinating story of a people, the first people to ever have a successful slave revolt and all the extraordinary culture that can be found there. So there are these two different stories that seem to some degree to be all part of you.
That's very, Tommy, it's honestly, it's very perceptive of you, because I had some critics who would say, well, if you want to pursue this hypothesis, make me some zombie rats, replicate this in the laboratory, make some zombie rats. And that was really, to my mind, to miss the entire point. People didn't understand the lengths that I was going to not to get the zombie poison as much as to tell the other story. It wasn't trivial to pursue membership in the Bizango-Champuel. At one point I had malaria and hepatitis for a month, and I didn't even know I was sick because I was just living the night shift and going out in the shadow of darkness and to these extraordinary events with hundreds, if not thousands of people dressed in robes and walking across the countryside with torches. Hundreds of pilgrims going to a waterfall, see these extraordinary men and women go beneath the battering water of the waterfall, allowing their rags to be torn from their bodies so that, like the snake that sheds its skin to be renewed, they too will be renewed for the coming year. I mean, it's absolutely stunningly kind of moving and beautiful.
As your book is, The Serpent and the Rainbow. A wild ride into the mysterious world of the island nation of Haiti. To enter into the world of Wade Davis and take in all the wondrous projects he's been involved in, just remember the name, Wade Davis, and flip the words. The website is daviswade.com. I enjoyed the conversation, Wade.
That's great, my friend. Thanks a lot. I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Remember when your bank knew your name? Not your account number, your name. When the person who approved your car loan saw you at the grocery store, asked how your kid's soccer team was doing? When local branch meant the banker lived here, worked here, sent their kids to school here, coached Little League here? That bank, That's almost extinct. Swallowed up, bought out, turned into a 1-800 number and a website. North American Banking Company has 6 locations in the Twin Cities, not 6,000, 6. Which means when you walk in, they know you. When you need a loan, they know your neighborhood. They know what that house of yours is actually worth. They know your business isn't a credit score. It's the coffee shop on Lyndale, the shop on Grand, the life you're actually living here. They're not trying to be big. They're trying to be the last ones standing who still believe banking should be personal. 6 locations, real people, your neighbors, North American Banking Company. Still here and not going anywhere.
Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
Okay, for the final segment of this program, I thought I would hearken back to that New Orleans trip from years ago, where I grabbed my recorder and went looking for a little adventure. It ties in a weird way, to the work of Wade Davis. Here's what that trip sounded like. Actor Matthew McConaughey said just recently, New Orleans is like a giant flashing yellow light. Proceed with caution, but proceed. Well, I proceeded. But what was I going to do with this city? Was I going to dive into the music, barrel full bore into the cuisine, buttonhole fishermen on Lake Pontchartrain and talk to them? The culture can drown you down here. I mean, it's too much, really. I wanted to go deep. Man, I wanted to go exotic. I wanted to go where I couldn't ever go back in Minnesota. I wanted to go in the direction of New Orleans voodoo. Yes, voodoo. But even going there, I was headed into a morass. African spiritual influences mixing with Haitian influences, French Catholic influences. And you also dive headlong into Native American spiritual traditions and Creole traditions. It's a thick, roiling stew, impossible to separate into any individual parts. New Orleans voodoo. Some mystical, magical, foreign, exotic, southern spiritual realm full of mystery and intrigue. I wanted to throw myself into foreign worlds on this trip. The more foreign, the better. But where could I find this unique world of voodoo made famous in books and Hollywood films and songs and stories and myths? Who would allow me in? Who would give me the time of day? Who would give me the time of day? What I had not realized was voodoo was so common in New Orleans, I could jump in a cab and the cab driver would talk to me about it. The 3 cab rides I had that particular weekend in New Orleans all involved people who dabbled in a little voodoo, like this cab driver here. Gotta come to New Orleans if you're going to do a story on voodoo.
That's correct.
You ever use it?
Yeah. And it worked.
It worked?
Yep.
What did you use it for?
I was having problems with his relationship. And she gave me, it was a spell, wrapped with a bow.
She put a spell in a small bag and wrapped it up?
Yeah, she said, when you put this in your pocket, the person you're having trouble with will no longer give you any more trouble. The man was giving me the trouble. He didn't want to let the relationship go. So she gave me something. I don't know if she was a priestess or what. She said, what do you need? And I said, well, I'm having problems with a gentleman who won't let the relationship go. And she says, use this. He will get the message. See, he was stalking me. That's what he was doing.
He was stalking you?
Yeah.
And how long did you have to keep that in your pocket? A few days?
No, weeks.
Oh, you kept it in your pocket for weeks?
Mm-hmm.
How long from the time you put it in your pocket till he quit bothering you?
About a week.
About a week. That's some powerful stuff. They say 15% of people in the state of Louisiana incorporate voodoo into their lives in some way, shape, or form. The percentage no doubt higher in New Orleans. From what I was able to gather during my time in the city, the voodoo there involves a belief in a visible and invisible world, with a thin veil separating the two. Like Catholicism, voodoo is monotheistic, but also like Catholicism, there is the veneration of deceased saints or spirits, and a belief in the power of a Holy Spirit. Voodoo practitioners call on the intercession of spirits. Those spirits have names. Voodoo practitioners also have a strong connection to their ancestors and believe they play a role in their lives. And in that sense, they are very much still of this world and in this world. According to the tradition of voodoo, humans enter into communication with the spirits in a very ritualized manner, becoming possessed by them. And then in that state, those spirits are able to serve people on the physical plane in various ways. Many of these spirits are capricious, and they will only be of help if one comes into contact with them correctly through elaborate rituals. Voodoo ceremonies embrace music and dance, food offerings, drumming, altars, talismans. I strolled into one voodoo temple near the edge of the French Quarter to speak with a 75-year-old woman there known as Priestess Miriam. She's had her temple in New Orleans for years, and people come to her for help in all sorts of areas of their lives. In fact, on the day I walked in the door, there was a businessman coming in right behind me, looking like he just walked out the door of some suburban office complex.
Who are you?
I had a friend of mine recommend that I come and see you because I just sold my company and got a lot of life changes. And I'm from Louisiana. I grew up in Shreveport, but it's been over a decade since I've been down here. She was like, "Oh, you've got to go see Priestess Miriam." So,
Priestess Miriam does not like talking about voodoo to media folk. I was one of the few she's ever allowed to even sit with her. You can dance around the subject of voodoo with her, but you can never really get too close to it. She starts to get too uncomfortable, or begins talking in a cryptic manner impossible to follow. She grew up in a sharecropping family, picking cotton. Like other voodoo priests or priestesses I would eventually encounter in New Orleans, she knew there was something different about her very early on.
My mom always said I was a very quiet child. Through my childhood, I would be sitting alone, away from all the other kids. I had not the ability to pick cotton. I have a sister who could pick cotton like that. But I would start off with everybody, and I would get way behind. Daydreaming. July was always the time that you had revival because people were sort of on a break from chopping until the cotton becomes season for picking. Always the first 2 weeks in July were revival time. So I remember in my mind, I never wanted to get up and just say I had religion. I was sitting and I asked the spirit to not let me just say I know him, but let me truly know him. And somehow in that evening, it was like this electrified energy just penetrated through my soul. It was an electrified moment. And it just made me rise and excited.
An electric charge of joy.
Yeah. It's like, makes you feel to shout. It makes you want to dance.
This experience of being filled with the Spirit in earlier Christian environments was not uncommon as I spoke with other people deeply involved in voodoo practices. They reported how this often opened them up to a much larger, grander, more intense, more powerful world of divinity. But when I asked Priestess Miriam to take me from that powerful experience into her voodoo practices today and how she got here and what all these practices involve, well, she changed her demeanor abruptly and once again talked of her problems with journalists. And she began to claim a level of ignorance when it came to her voodoo practice, telling me she doesn't really know what she does. It was mildly frustrating. No matter what road I went down, trying to get at the heart of her spirituality, she put up a wall.
I can't even tell you anything. I don't know anything right now. I don't know anything right now.
You are reluctant, and I wonder where that reluctance comes from.
I'm not reluctant to do anything.
At this point in the conversation, I heard a noise inside a box that was sitting at my feet, a cardboard box. It was the sound of something moving around. It turned out to be a mouse that this priestess had brought in that day, intending to feed it to her serpent.
I don't know what that is. Oh, that's the mouse in the box. I forgot I brought some mouse for my serpent.
For your serpent?
Of course.
Where's the serpent?
You might be it now.
I'm not a serpent.
Well, we all are.
What do you do with the serpent?
Well, it's what she does.
What kind of snake is that?
Python. She came to me. She came to me in my sleep in 1990 and looked me in my face.
And when she came to you in your sleep and looked at you, was there a message?
Spirit chooses you. Life can evolve you in many directions. Out of every human's life, God has spoken. St. John says, out of the depths of my soul comes the light. Darkness within, and light shines out of darkness, and all things precede us.
New Orleans always seemed to me to be the American city least like the rest of America. Wildly, wonderfully different. And I wasn't done running into voodoo practitioners. The next day, I met a voodoo priest right where I was staying. Tamu was his name. His ancestors were all from New Orleans, but he had left as a young man and ventured north, joining a Christian church, only to eventually feel the calling to come back to his spiritual roots.
I was called from out of what I was taught, from out of Christianity. I caught a lot of flack for questioning. I'm not one easily sold on a story just because you tell it to me and it's repeated several times. We were invited to a voodoo ceremony. The ceremony had already started. It was already fully in. You know, they were playing music and people were going into possession. And I was just there assisting, helping to make sure people stayed safe. Nobody fell and got hurt or anything like that. Because when you go into possession, you know, you open yourself up as a vessel, and people have known to do some very supernatural things. It's not evil. It's not the devil. As a matter of fact, you can see all of these different practices being utilized in the church, in the Christian church. Speaking tongues, you know, it's the same thing.
Slain by the Spirit. You hear that a lot.
Slain by the Spirit. I'm glad you said that. And so, not knowing it, because I'm just new here. I had only been here 2 weeks, literally 14 days. Two of the godmothers, or the priestesses, as they say in their terminology, yay, they do a head washing and a blessing, similar to being christened, so to speak. So the yay, she washed my head first, and I could feel a calming come on me. But then the next line I got into, I had to wait a little longer for the head yay, or the grandmother. And when she washed my head, I had to get on one knee and lean forward. And she started touching my head and doing Santeria and prayers over me. And spirit hit me and I fell out. And at that time, what I saw was a line of my ancestors who were waiting for me, and they literally were welcoming me. It was like they were coming up out of the ground and telling me, you have a responsibility to uphold. There are many people who are going to need your healing, your strength. Honor us. To have this experience the way that I did, it was remarkable. A doorway was being opened for me ancestrally.
Tumu's ancestral mix includes Native American, African American, Creole, and Irish. Also, within 2 weeks of arriving in New Orleans, Tumu was asked to join the North Side Skull and Bones Gang, a group whose roots go back to 1819. They can be found in the Tremé neighborhood just north of the French Quarter on Mardi Gras morning, dressed in primitive skeleton outfits, going house to house, waking people up and reminding them of their mortality and consequently their need to live well and live right. It is considered a high honor to be chosen as a bonesman.
We are the first gang out Mardi Gras or Carnival morning, and we wake everybody up 5:30, creating a lot of fanfare, traditional African drumming, some dancing, and we walk out the door and you hear, ah, ah. That's the sound of the wild man. The wild man is the ones who protect the people in the village. Try to remind people, one day you too will pass on, so leave a good legacy. We are being watched from the other side, whether we recognize it or not. Ultimately, what every man and woman wants when they come in this world is not only to belong, but to know that they belong to a group that loves them, protects them, will nurture them. Essentially, that to me is what we're searching for the whole time we're here. We don't really find our use and our purpose until we find those groups, people like ourselves. And for me, I'm just an average person who wants to see right done in the world, and not necessarily the right that I want to see, but the right that's going to bring healing for everybody. The city of New Orleans is in itself older than everything in the United States. This city's spirit is a lot different than anything else in the United States. You can't compare New York or LA or Cleveland or Atlanta. There's nothing like it. I'm telling you, I've been to some places that have some real energy, and nothing like New Orleans. Nothing like New Orleans at all. People have migrated from all over the world for as long as you can think of, migrated here. This is a very ancient worship center.
What is the most powerful thing that's ever happened to you within voodoo?
I would have to say it's possession. There is no higher form of communication with the Creator. I've dealt with possession from the time I was a young child. I didn't know that's what was going on. The first time I actually went into possession was in church. I was in a Pentecostal church. I was 18, in the midst of singing and praising and speaking in tongues. I opened up. And at that time, I was kind of scared at first because I thought that it was evil. But then I knew it couldn't be evil because in that state, it was such a divine, such an enlightening, such a freeing experience as I was singing and clapping and speaking in tongues. You can kind of say it's like an out-of-body experience, but it's not, because I was there, I was present. I could see the energy that I was harnessing. It almost felt like an angel was holding me. That's the only way that I could try to at best describe it. There was no pain. There was an absolute freedom. It changed my thoughts of how I was serving God, because I felt like I was being limited by what I was being taught. based on what I had just experienced. And
in other words, what you experienced was so far beyond.
It was so far beyond all of my life being raised Christian. You hear about voodoo and it being evil, and here it is, I'm having an experience that they say that you have in these so-called pagan practices in church.
Sally Ann Glassman has been immersed in the world of voodoo for over 40 years. She's one of the very few white Americans to have been made an ordained priestess through traditional Haitian initiation. She's lectured extensively on voodoo and has received international television, radio, and press coverage, including a front-page article in the New York Times and a feature on World News Tonight. She's also been written about in the LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle, New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, National Geographic, and Washington Post.
I was brought up in an absolutely atheistic family. Ukrainian Jewish. I'm second generation U.S. And my older brother was born the year World War II ended. So my dad was a little disappointed in God. He and my mother were both absolute atheists. I would sneak out of the house to go to religious services in different places. Instead of going to bars with my friends, I would sneak out to an Easter celebration or a Passover Seder. I just liked being in the environment of spirit. I liked being in sacred ground, soaking up that atmosphere. And
why did you like it?
Well, for me, I did not see the world the way everybody else did. And it took me a very long time to realize that not everybody saw it the way I did. For me, the physical, material world just looked and looks like a mirror reflection over energy flows. And so I didn't explain that to anybody because I didn't know they didn't see it that way. And ultimately, I started to put together that adults were a little taken aback by me. They were uncomfortable around me. They would describe me as a scary little kid. And trying to have conversations with people, I slowly realized that I was seeing more than they were telling me and that they wanted to show. They present themselves in a certain way, and I was not seeing that. I was seeing something very different that got to their core. And I realized that that was really invasive and that I needed a way to turn that off and on. Mm-hmm. So I ultimately became aware that I had a mystical bent. In high school, people called me the Mystic Wonder, and I didn't know why they called me that, except I would find myself being asked questions that I certainly had no business giving the answers to, and my mouth would be open. I'd be talking. I'd be telling people things. I didn't know what I was saying, and they would be affected by it. It would be helpful to them. And it took me a very long time to realize that I was having conversations with people and they didn't know what I was talking about, that we just didn't have agreement on it. But I came to New Orleans in 76 and started actively looking at voodoo then. I had the same fears about it that everybody else has instilled in them. I thought it was evil and I was jeopardizing my soul by even saying the word. And I finally wondered why I was so afraid of something that I didn't know anything about. And I'd had enough experience to know that I'm often afraid of things that are offering me tools to my own freedom. And so in 95, I went to Haiti and initiated and discovered a country where everybody saw the world as a mirror image over flows of energy, and that energy has intelligence, and that there are methods for setting up formulas for reaching into that invisible world of energy. And that's why voodoo, I think, is really challenging for people, for a lot of people, and why it's frightening. First of all, that belief that there is an invisible world that is more powerful, it's more beautiful, it's more full of potential. And, that was a lifesaver for the slaves, and it was really unnerving for the slave owners. So that's part of it, that there's this access to an invisible power that's greater than any earthly power.
and the slave owners couldn't control it. So, there was a definite campaign that was intended to divorce people from the practice of the religion, to disempower them. But I think also all of us as humans, the implications are so vast. If your identity can be moved aside and something much greater than you can inhabit you right. for a time being, and can do these extraordinary things, including know things about people that you don't know, it really challenges our sense of reality. I think for most people, it's much easier to say to me, "You're nuts." My whole approach to Vodou is to be of service. That is it. There's nothing I want to get from the spirit. When I was initiating, all kinds of Ungans and Mambos, priests and priestesses, came into the chamber where I was initiating and said, "Don't think this is going to make your life any easier. It's not going to get you a rich husband. It's not going to get you a nice car." Also, never forget that this was a religion of people who were enslaved, and they lost everything. And instead of feeling like their spirits weren't worthwhile or that they had failed them, they held on to their beliefs, and that's really humbling. Slaves built the city, and they brought Vodou with them. New Orleans had an influx of people from Saint-Domingue, Haiti, around 1810, after the revolution. 10,000 people came into the city, and it doubled the population, and certainly reaffirmed the presence of that worldview. And you see it traced throughout our culture in the city. New Orleans remains unique in an increasingly generic world here in the U.S. And part of that, I think, is our location in the swamp. And part of that is just that the very same factors that went into creating Vodou in Haiti were present here. We had Native Americans, we had French European Catholics, we had Masons, we had African slaves, and it just brewed here. And the whole history of New Orleans has been so tumultuous and so exotic, and there are all these spirits floating around. When my papa from Haiti would come and visit, he'd say he'd found it pretty unnerving because he kept bumping into spirits here, and it was hard to walk down the street. It's just what New Orleans is.